The mountain winds howled through the pine trees as Sarah Mitchell stumbled through the darkness, her swollen belly making each step a battle against exhaustion. Blood trickled from the corner of her mouth, and her left eye was swollen shut from the latest beating. Behind her, somewhere in the valley below, Marcus was probably discovering her absence by now. The thought sent ice through her veins. She had exactly one chance at freedom, and she was 7 months pregnant. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The nightmare had started 3 years ago when Sarah thought she'd found her prince charming. Marcus Holloway had swept into her small hometown of Cedar Falls, Montana, with his expensive suits and charming smile. He owned a chain of auto dealerships across the state, drove a gleaming BMW, and treated her like royalty during their whirlwind courtship. "You're going to live like a queen, sweetheart," he'd whispered during their honeymoon in Hawaii, sliding a diamond bracelet onto her wrist. "Nothing but the best for my beautiful wife." The first red flag came 6 months into their marriage when Sarah mentioned wanting to keep her job at the local library. Marcus had laughed, but there was something cold behind his eyes. "My wife doesn't need to work," he'd said, his grip on her shoulder just a little too tight. "What would people think? That I can't provide for my own family?" Sarah had given up her job, telling herself it was temporary. She'd always loved books and helping people find stories that transported them to other worlds. But Marcus insisted that her place was at home, making their house perfect for his business associates and potential clients. The isolation crept in slowly. First, Marcus convinced her that her best friend Jessica was jealous of their success. Then he pointed out how her sister Emma always seemed to be asking for money, suggesting she was just using Sarah. One by one, the people in her life disappeared until only Marcus remained. "You don't need anyone else," he'd say, stroking her hair with deceptive gentleness. "I'm all you need. We're all each other." The first time he hit her was on their first anniversary. Sarah had made his favorite dinner but forgotten to chill the wine. The backhand came so fast she barely registered it before her cheek exploded in pain. "Look what you made me do," Marcus had said, his voice breaking with what seemed like genuine remorse. "Baby, I'm so sorry. You know I love you more than life itself. It's just ... When things aren't perfect, it reminds me of my childhood. My father used to beat my mother when she messed up, and I swore I'd never be like him." He'd held her while she cried, promising it would never happen again, buying her an expensive necklace the next day. Sarah desperately wanted to believe him. She'd grown up in foster care after her parents died in a car crash when she was 8. She'd dreamed of having a real family, a home where she belonged. But it did happen again. And again, the pattern became sickeningly familiar. Marcus would explode over something trivial. Dinner being 5 minutes late, Sarah wearing a dress he decided was too revealing, or simply because he'd had a bad day at work. The violence would be followed by tears, apologies, and expensive gifts. Then weeks of him being the perfect husband, until the next eruption. Sarah learned to walk on eggshells, studying his moods like a meteorologist tracking storm systems. She developed elaborate strategies to avoid triggering his rage. She laid out his clothes each morning in a specific order, timed his meals to the minute, and learned to make herself invisible when his jaw tensed in that particular way that meant danger. The beatings grew worse after she got pregnant. Marcus had been ecstatic at first, talking about his heir and how perfect their family would be. But as Sarah's body changed, his violence became more calculated, more cruel. "Can't damage the merchandise," he'd sneer, aiming his fists at her ribs and back where the bruises wouldn't show. "But you still need to learn your place." He controlled every aspect of her pregnancy. He chose her doctor, a golf buddy who asked no uncomfortable questions about her frequent accidents. He monitored her diet obsessively, claiming he wanted A healthy baby, but using it as another way to control her. He even picked out baby names without consulting her. "We're naming him Marcus Jr.," he'd announced one evening over dinner. "And if it's a girl, we'll call her Marcia." After me, Sarah had suggested other names, but Marcus had shut her down immediately. "This is my child," he'd said, his voice dropping to that dangerous whisper. "My blood, my legacy. I decide what's best." The final straw came on a cold February night when Sarah was 7 months pregnant. She'd been feeling unwell all day, sharp pains in her abdomen that worried her. When she timidly suggested calling the doctor, Marcus had exploded. "You're fine," he'd snarled. "Stop being dramatic. You women always exaggerate everything when you're pregnant." But the pains had gotten worse, and Sarah had made the mistake of calling the doctor herself. Dr. Reynolds had insisted she come in immediately, and the examination revealed she was having early contractions that could lead to premature labor. When Marcus found out she'd called the doctor without permission, his rage was unlike anything Sarah had ever seen. He dragged her into their bedroom and unleashed a beating that left her barely conscious on the floor. "You don't make decisions about my child," he'd screamed, kicking her in the back as she tried to protect her belly. "You don't do anything without my permission." That night, as Marcus slept off his fury, aided by half a bottle of whiskey, Sarah lay awake planning her escape. She'd tried to leave before, but Marcus always found her. He had connections everywhere. Police officers who owed him favors, private investigators on his payroll, business associates in every major city in the state. But this time was different. This time, she wasn't just running for herself. Sarah had been secretly saving money for months, skimming small amounts from grocery money and hiding them in a hollowed-out book in the basement, one of the few remnants from her old life that Marcus had allowed her to keep. She'd accumulated nearly $800, enough to disappear if she was careful. She'd also been researching routes through the mountains, using the computer at the public library during Marcus's business trips. The Glacier Peak wilderness stretched for hundreds of miles of rugged, barely inhabited terrain. If she could make it deep enough into the mountains, even Marcus's resources couldn't track her. The plan was desperate and dangerous, especially for a pregnant woman, but staying meant certain death for both her and her baby. Sarah waited until Marcus's snoring reached that deep, drunk rhythm that meant he wouldn't wake for hours. Moving like a ghost, she gathered her few essential items: the hidden money, a small bag of clothes, some basic food supplies, and a hunting knife she'd found in the garage. She left behind everything else: the jewelry, the designer clothes, the life she'd thought she'd wanted. None of it had ever really been hers anyway. The February night was brutally cold as Sarah slipped out the back door of their mansion on the outskirts of Cedar Falls. Snow crunched under her feet, each step echoing like thunder in her terrified mind. She made it to the old truck she'd hidden behind the abandoned gas station on the edge of town, a vehicle she'd bought for cash from a farmer who didn't ask questions. The truck's engine turned over on the third try, and Sarah pulled onto Highway 2 heading toward the mountains. In her rearview mirror, the lights of Cedar Falls grew smaller and smaller until they disappeared entirely. She drove for 3 hours, taking back roads and Forest Service routes she'd memorized from her research. The truck handled the increasingly rough terrain with determination, but Sarah knew she couldn't drive much further. The roads would become impassable soon, and she needed to ditch the vehicle before Marcus discovered it. Finally, as dawn began to break over the snow-covered peaks, Sarah pulled into a clearing beside Clearwater Creek. This was as far as wheels could take her. From here, she would have to travel on foot into some of the most unforgiving wilderness in North America. She gathered her supplies and began walking toward the tree line, each step taking her further from the life that had nearly destroyed her and deeper into an uncertain future. The baby kicked inside her, as if sensing the magnitude of their journey. Behind her, the truck sat empty and abandoned, the only evidence that Sarah Mitchell had ever existed slowly being covered by fresh snowfall. Ahead lay hundreds of miles of mountains, forests, and dangers she couldn't imagine. But for the first time in 3 years, Sarah was free. The wilderness swallowed Sarah whole within the first hour of walking. The trail she'd found on her maps existed more in theory than reality, overgrown with brambles and blocked by fallen trees that forced her to climb over or detour around obstacles that seemed designed to test her resolve. Her breath came in sharp puffs of white vapor as the altitude began affecting her lungs. The pregnancy made everything harder. Her center of gravity had shifted, making the uneven terrain treacherous. Her back ached constantly, and the baby seemed to press against her ribs with every step. But Sarah pressed on, driven by a terror more powerful than physical discomfort. Every snapping twig behind her sounded like Marcus's footsteps. Every distant bird call could be search dogs. She wouldn't feel safe until she was deep enough in the mountains that even his money and connections couldn't reach her. The first day tested her limits in ways she hadn't anticipated. The pregnancy books had mentioned fatigue and shortness of breath, but they hadn't prepared her for how quickly her body would betray her in the wild. By noon, she was stopping every few hundred yards to rest, her legs shaking with exhaustion. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Worse was the cold. February in the Montana wilderness was unforgiving, and Sarah's hastily packed clothes weren't adequate for extended exposure. She'd grabbed a winter coat and gloves, but her feet were already going numb in her sneakers, and ice was forming on her eyelashes. As afternoon wore into evening, Sarah realized she needed shelter before nightfall, or she would die of exposure. She'd read about hypothermia in her research, but experiencing the early stages was terrifying. Her thoughts were becoming sluggish, and she kept forgetting why she was walking. Then she spotted smoke. A thin tendril of gray rose from somewhere deeper in the valley, barely visible against the overcast sky. Sarah's heart was hammered with conflicting emotions. Smoke meant people, warmth, and possible rescue. But it also meant potential discovery. What if Marcus had already mobilized search teams? What if these were hunters who would recognize her from missing person reports? As darkness fell and the temperature plummeted, survival instinct overrode caution. Sarah stumbled toward the smoke source, following a deer path that wound between towering pines heavy with snow. The cabin materialized out of the forest like something from a fairy tale. Built from massive logs and nestled in a protected grove, it looked like it had grown from the mountain itself. Warm yellow light glowed from the windows, and the smoke she'd seen was rising from a stone chimney. Sarah crouched behind a boulder 50 yards away, studying the building. It was larger than she'd expected, but clearly isolated. No power lines, no road access that she could see. This wasn't a weekend retreat. Someone lived here year-round. She waited in the shadows for nearly an hour, shivering violently as the cold seeped through her coat. No vehicles appeared, no voices carried on the wind. Just the steady glow of firelight and the occasional shadow moving past the windows. Finally, when she could no longer feel her fingers or toes, Sarah made her decision. She would rather face a stranger than freeze to death in the wilderness. The walk to the front door felt like a mile. Each step brought new possibilities of danger, but also the promise of warmth. Sarah's legs nearly gave out as she climbed the 3 wooden steps to a covered porch, decorated with wind chimes made from polished stones. She raised her numb fist to knock, then hesitated. Once she did this, there was no going back to anonymity. Someone would see her face, know she existed, possibly remember her if questioned later. Before she could lose her nerve, Sarah knocked 3 times. The footsteps inside were heavy but measured. Sarah heard what sounded like a large dog moving around, followed by a man's voice speaking quietly. Locks turned, multiple locks, and the door opened to reveal the largest human being Sarah had ever seen. He stood at least 6.5 feet tall with shoulders that filled the doorframe. His hair was dark brown streaked with premature gray, pulled back in a ponytail that reached between his shoulder blades. A full beard covered the lower half of his face, and his eyes were the color of winter storms. But it was his expression that stopped Sarah's prepared story cold. Instead of surprise or suspicion, she saw immediate concern and something else, recognition of someone in desperate trouble. "Jesus," he said softly, his voice a deep rumble with traces of a southern accent. "Ma'am, you need to get inside right now." He stepped back, gesturing her into the warmth, and Sarah noticed his movements were careful and non-threatening despite his imposing size. A massive German shepherd appeared at his side, alert but not aggressive. "I'm sorry," Sarah began, her teeth chattering so hard she could barely speak. "I got lost and saw your smoke. Don't apologize," the man said firmly, closing the door behind her. "You're hypothermic. We need to get you warmed up before anything else." The interior of the cabin was a revelation. Sarah had expected rough mountain living, but this was a home. Polished wood floors covered with hand-woven rugs, walls lined with books, comfortable furniture arranged around a massive stone fireplace. The air smelled of wood smoke and something delicious cooking. "Sit here," he said, guiding her to a chair near the fire. "Don't move too close too fast. You need to warm up gradually." He disappeared into another room and returned with an armload of blankets and what looked like medical supplies. Sarah noticed he moved with surprising grace for such a large man, and there was an efficiency to his actions that suggested medical training. "I'm going to check your core temperature," he said, holding up a thermometer. "And I need to look at your hands and feet for frostbite. Is that okay?" Sarah nodded, too cold and exhausted to do anything but follow his lead. As he gently examined her extremities, she studied his face. Despite his intimidating size, there was gentleness in his touch and genuine concern in his expression. "You're lucky," he said after checking the thermometer. "The temperature's low, but not dangerously so. No frostbite, just some minor tissue damage that'll heal, but if you'd been out there much longer..." He didn't finish the sentence, but Sarah understood. She'd been hours away from dying in the wilderness. "Thank you," she whispered, finally able to speak without her teeth chattering. "I don't know how to repay you." "No repayment necessary," he said, settling into a chair across from her. The German shepherd lay down at his feet, keeping watchful eyes on Sarah. "I'm Daniel Brooks. This is Thunder. And you are?" Sarah hesitated. She hadn't prepared a false identity, and lying to someone who just saved her life felt wrong. But the truth was too dangerous. "I'm Sarah," she said finally, deciding to keep her first name, Sarah Williams. If Daniel noticed her hesitation, he didn't comment. Instead, he studied her face with those storm-gray eyes, and Sarah had the uncomfortable feeling he was seeing more than she wanted to reveal. "Well, Sarah Williams," he said quietly, "you want to tell me how a pregnant woman ends up alone in the wilderness in February with no proper gear and bruises on her face?" Sarah's hand flew instinctively to her cheek. She'd forgotten about the marks from Marcus's latest beating. In the firelight, they were probably impossible to hide. "I fell," she said automatically, the lie she'd used countless times over the past 3 years. Daniel's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. "Must have been quite a fall," he said carefully, "multiple times from the look of it." Sarah felt tears threatening and fought them back. She couldn't afford to break down now. "I should go," she said, starting to stand. "I don't want to impose ... "Where?" Daniel asked quietly. "It's 10 degrees outside and snowing. You're 7 months pregnant and just recovered from hypothermia. Where exactly are you planning to go?" The simple question shattered Sarah's fragile composure. The tears she'd been holding back for months came in a flood, and suddenly she was sobbing uncontrollably. All the fear, pain, and desperation of the past 3 years poured out of her. Daniel didn't try to comfort her or ask questions. He simply sat quietly while she cried, occasionally adding wood to the fire. Thunder moved closer to Sarah's chair, as if sensing her distress. When the tears finally subsided, Sarah felt simultaneously drained and lighter. She hadn't cried, really cried, since the first time Marcus hit her. "I'm sorry," she said, wiping her eyes with the blanket Daniel had given her. "Nothing to be sorry for," he replied. "But I think we should get some food in you. When's the last time you ate?" Sarah tried to remember. She'd packed some energy bars, but fear had killed her appetite. Yesterday morning, maybe? Daniel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He rose and moved to what Sarah could now see was a well-equipped kitchen area. She watched him work, noting the easy competence with which he handled the cooking implements. "Venison stew," he said, ladling soup into a bowl. "Shot the deer myself last month. It's protein and iron, good for the baby." The stew was the most delicious thing Sarah had ever tasted, or maybe she was just starving. Either way, she finished the entire bowl and accepted a second serving. "How far along?" Daniel asked as she ate. 7 months, Sarah said, then realized she was answering automatically. This man had a way of making her feel safe enough to speak truthfully. "First baby?" Sarah nodded. "Boy or girl?" "I don't know," she admitted. "I wanted it to be a surprise." What she didn't say was that Marcus had forbidden her from finding out the gender. He'd wanted to control that revelation too, claiming it would be more meaningful if they discovered it together during delivery. Daniel seemed to sense there was more to the story, but he didn't push. Instead, he continued the gentle small talk that helped Sarah relax for the first time in months. As the evening wore on, exhaustion caught up with her. The warmth, food, and safety made her eyelids heavy. She found herself struggling to stay awake. "There's a guest room upstairs," Daniel said quietly. "Clean sheets, warm blankets. You need rest." Sarah wanted to protest, to maintain some pretense of independence, but her body was already shutting down. "Just for tonight," she said weakly. "As long as you need," Daniel replied, and something in his tone made Sarah believe he meant it. The guest room was simple but comfortable, a handmade wooden bed covered with quilts, a small dresser, and a window that looked out over the dark forest. Daniel had left clean clothes on the bed, a flannel shirt and sweatpants that would be enormous on her but warm. As Sarah changed clothes, she caught her reflection in the dresser mirror. The woman looking back was almost unrecognizable. Gaunt cheeks, hollow eyes, and the telltale marks of abuse that no amount of makeup could have hidden. But for the first time in years, she also saw something else in her expression: hope. Outside, the wind howled through the pines and snow continued to fall. But inside the mountain cabin, Sarah felt safer than she had since before her wedding day. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, or whether she could trust the giant of a man who'd taken her in. But tonight, for the first time in 3 years, she would sleep without fear. Sarah woke to the sound of splitting wood and the rich aroma of coffee brewing. Sunlight streamed through the guest room window, revealing a winter wonderland that looked nothing like the threatening wilderness she'd stumbled through the day before. Fresh snow had transformed the forest into something magical, with ice crystals sparkling like diamonds on every branch. For a moment, she forgot where she was. The bed was more comfortable than anything she'd slept in for years, and the absence of fear was so profound it felt like a physical weight had been lifted from her chest. Then reality crashed back. Marcus, the beating, her desperate flight into the mountains. She sat up carefully, assessing her body's condition. The baby was active this morning, rolling and kicking in response to her movement. Her back still ached, but the sharp pains from her injuries had dulled to manageable soreness. Most importantly, She felt rested for the first time in months. Through the window, she could see Daniel working in a cleared area behind the cabin. He'd removed his shirt despite the cold, and Sarah was struck by the sheer physical power of the man who'd taken her in. His torso was a map of scars, some surgical, others clearly from violence. This wasn't someone who'd lived a sheltered life. As she watched, he split logs with an efficiency that spoke of years of practice. Each swing of the massive axe was perfectly controlled, sending wood flying in precise halves. Thunder sat nearby, alert and watchful, occasionally lifting his head to scan the forest perimeter. Sarah made her way downstairs, moving carefully on legs still weak from yesterday's ordeal. The main room looked different in daylight, larger, more lived in. Bookshelves lined every wall, containing everything from medical textbooks to classic literature. A workbench in one corner held intricate wood carvings in various stages of completion. "Morning," Daniel's voice came from behind her. She turned to find him entering through the back door, carrying an armload of firewood. He'd put his shirt back on, but Sarah had already noticed the care with which he moved, someone accustomed to managing his size in confined spaces. "I hope I didn't oversleep," Sarah said, suddenly self-conscious in his oversized clothes. "You needed it," Daniel replied, setting down the wood and moving to the kitchen area. "Coffee? It's decaf. Figured that was better for the baby." The thoughtfulness of that small gesture nearly brought tears to Sarah's eyes. Marcus had never shown such consideration for her pregnancy, viewing it only as it related to his heir. "Thank you," she said, accepting the warm mug. The coffee was rich and perfectly brewed, another small luxury she hadn't realized she'd missed. "How are you feeling?" Daniel asked, studying her face with those perceptive gray eyes. "Better," Sarah admitted. "Much better. But I should probably be moving on soon. Where to?" The simple question stopped her cold. Where was she going? Her plan had extended only as far as getting away from Marcus. She had no destination, no support network, no resources beyond the few $100s in her backpack. "I'm not sure yet," she said quietly. Daniel poured himself coffee and settled into the chair across from her. "Sarah," he said gently, "I don't know what you're running from, but you're 7 months pregnant. It's February in the Montana wilderness, and you nearly died of exposure yesterday. Moving on isn't really an option right now." "I can't stay here," Sarah protested. "It's not fair to you, and it's not safe." "Not safe for who?" Sarah caught herself before she revealed too much. "For anyone," she said carefully. Daniel was quiet for a long moment, sipping his coffee and studying her face. When he spoke again, his voice was gentle but firm. "I spent 12 years as a combat medic," he said. "Army Special Forces. I've seen what men can do to women, and I know the look of someone who's been systematically brutalized. I also know that pregnant women don't usually flee into winter wilderness unless they're running from something worse than freezing to death." Sarah's hands tightened around her coffee mug. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Your bruises have specific patterns," Daniel continued, his voice clinical but kind. "Defensive wounds on your forearms. Impact marks on your ribs that suggest someone who knew how to hurt you without leaving visible damage. And you flinch every time I move. Too quickly." The accuracy of his observations was terrifying. Sarah had thought she'd hidden the signs better. "Even if that were true," she said carefully, "what difference would it make? Some situations can't be fixed." "Maybe not," Daniel agreed. "But they can be survived. And sometimes that's enough to start over." Something in his tone made Sarah look at him more closely. There was pain in his expression, old and carefully managed, but still present. "Is that what you did?" she asked. "Start over?" Daniel's smile was rueful. "Something like that. This cabin, this life. It's my 3rd attempt at getting things right." "What happened to the first 2? "War happened to the first one," Daniel said quietly. I came back from Afghanistan a different person than the one who left. PTSD, anger issues, the whole package. Lost my wife, my house, my job, everything that mattered. And the second? Tried to fix the first one with alcohol and bad decisions. That ended about as well as you'd expect. He gestured around the cabin. This is attempt number 3. Been living up here for 5 years now, and it's the first time I've felt like myself since I was 22 years old. Sarah absorbed this information, trying to reconcile the gentle giant who'd saved her with the damaged soldier he'd described. What changed? Isolation helped, Daniel said. Up here, I only have to worry about keeping myself alive. No crowds. No unexpected noises. No one depending on me to be something I couldn't be anymore. But isn't it lonely? Lonely's better than dangerous, Daniel replied. At least it was until yesterday. What do you mean? Daniel met her eyes directly. I mean that for the first time in 5 years, I have someone depending on me again. And that scares the hell out of me. The honesty in his admission took Sarah's breath away. She'd grown so accustomed to Marcus's manipulations and calculated emotions that Daniel's raw truthfulness was almost overwhelming. You don't owe me anything, she said softly. I showed up uninvited. You showed up half dead, Daniel corrected. And pregnant. And running from someone who did this to you. He gestured at her fading bruises. That doesn't create obligation. It creates opportunity. Opportunity for what? To do something right for once. The conversation was interrupted by Thunder's low growl. The German shepherd had risen from his position by the fire and was staring intently at the front door. Hackles raised. Daniel was on his feet instantly, moving with fluid speed that contradicted his size. Stay here, he said quietly, pulling what Sarah now realized was a rifle from a cabinet near the door. What is it? Sarah whispered, fear flooding back into her system. Probably nothing, Daniel said, but his body language suggested otherwise. Thunder's got good instincts, though. Someone's coming up the trail. Sarah's blood turned to ice. Marcus had found her. Somehow, impossibly, he'd trapped her to this remote cabin. Her sanctuary was about to become her trap. Back door, she whispered urgently. I need to run. No, Daniel said firmly. You're not running anywhere in your condition. Let me handle this. Through the window, Sarah could see movement in the tree line, multiple figures in winter gear, moving with purpose toward the cabin. Her worst fears were materializing before her eyes. Then Daniel did something unexpected. He set the rifle aside and opened the front door, stepping onto the porch with his hands visible and empty. Help you folks with something? He called out, his voice carrying easily across the clearing. 3 men emerged from the forest, wearing the uniforms of the local sheriff's department. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. Marcus had mobilized law enforcement to find her. Morning, Mr. Brooks, the lead officer called back. Sarah recognized him from news reports, Sheriff Tom Crawford, a heavy-set man in his 50s who'd been elected primarily on his promise to support local business interests. Sorry to bother you, but we're conducting a search operation. Search? For what? Daniel asked, maintaining his relaxed posture despite the tension Sarah could see in his shoulders. Missing person, Crawford replied, climbing the steps to the porch. Pregnant woman named Sarah Mitchell. Her husband reported her missing 2 days ago. Said she might have had some kind of mental breakdown and wandered off. Sarah pressed herself against the wall beside the window, trying to become invisible. Marcus was already crafting the narrative, painting her as mentally unstable to explain her disappearance. Haven't seen anyone, Daniel said calmly. Been snowed in up here for the past week. Mind if we take a look around? Crawford asked, but his tone suggested it wasn't really a question. Actually, I do mind, Daniel replied, his voice hardening slightly. You got a warrant, Tom? The sheriff's expression grew less friendly. Now, Daniel, don't make this difficult. We're just trying to find a missing woman who might be in danger. And I'm just protecting my constitutional rights, Daniel replied evenly. You want to search my property, you know what you need to bring. Sarah watched the standoff through the window, hardly daring to breathe. She could see the calculation in Crawford's eyes, weighing the political cost of forcing a confrontation with a decorated veteran against the pressure he was undoubtedly getting from Marcus. Her husband's real worried, Crawford said, trying a different approach. Rich fellow, owns them car dealerships down in Cedar Falls. He's offering a substantial reward for information leading to her safe return. How substantial? Daniel asked, and Sarah felt a stab of fear. Was he considering turning her in? $25,000, Crawford replied. That's a lot of money for information about a woman who might be hurt and confused. Daniel was quiet for a long moment. Then, I'll keep my eyes open. If I see anything, I'll give you a call. Crawford clearly wasn't satisfied with this response. But he also wasn't prepared to escalate the situation without legal backing. You do that, Daniel. And remember, if this woman's out there in the wilderness, every hour counts. She could die of exposure. I understand the urgency, Daniel replied. Have a good day, Sheriff. Sarah watched the three officers retreat into the forest, disappearing as quickly as they'd appeared. She remained frozen against the wall until Daniel came back inside and secured the door. They're gone, he said quietly. For now, Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. But they'll be back. And next time they'll have a warrant. Daniel studied her face intently. Sarah Mitchell, he said. That's your real name? There was no point denying it now. Sarah nodded miserably. And Marcus Mitchell, he's your husband? Another nod. The one who did this to you? Yes, Sarah whispered, the admission feeling like another kind of escape. Daniel absorbed this information without visible judgment. $25,000 is a lot of money, he said finally. Sarah's heart sank. Of course he would turn her in. She'd been naive to think a stranger would risk everything for someone he'd just met. I understand, she said, moving toward her backpack. I'll leave now, before they come back. Where are you going? Daniel asked. I don't know, Sarah admitted. But I won't let them find me here. You've done enough. Sarah. Daniel's voice stopped her movement. I wasn't suggesting we turn you in. I was thinking that $25,000 means your husband has serious resources. The kind that can buy cooperation from people who should know better. Relief flooded through Sarah, followed immediately by a new wave of fear. What do we do? We? Daniel asked, one eyebrow raised. Sarah faltered, realizing her presumption. I'm sorry. I mean, what do I do? Daniel's expression softened. We figure out how to keep you alive until that baby's born, and you're strong enough to disappear properly. But first, you need to tell me everything about Marcus Mitchell. His resources, his connections, his methods. Because if we're going to beat him, I need to know exactly what we're up against. The word "we" hit Sarah like a physical blow. For 3 years, she'd faced Marcus's abuse alone, isolated and helpless. The idea that someone was willing to stand with her against him seemed impossible. Why? She asked, tears threatening again. Why would you risk everything for someone you barely know? Daniel was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. When he spoke, his voice was soft but determined. Because 5 years ago, I was broken and dangerous and convinced I didn't deserve saving. Someone took a chance on me anyway, gave me the resources to find this place and start over. I never got the chance to repay that kindness. He looked at Sarah directly, his gray eyes steady and sure. Maybe this is how I do it. Over the next 3 days, Sarah told Daniel everything. She spoke of Marcus's controlling nature, his violent outbursts, and the systematic way he'd isolated her from anyone who might have helped. She described his business empire, his political connections, and the network of favors and obligations he'd built across Montana's power structure. Daniel listened without judgment, occasionally asking clarifying questions, but mostly letting Sarah purge years of accumulated terror and shame. With each revelation, she could see him building a mental profile of their enemy, cataloging threats and identifying vulnerabilities. "He owns 3 judges," Sarah explained as they sat by the fire on the 3rd evening. "I heard him bragging to his business partner about how much their campaigns cost him. And the sheriff we met the other day, Crawford, he's been to our house for dinner parties. Marcus calls him Tom, like they're old friends." "What about federal law enforcement?" Daniel asked. "FBI, U.S. Marshals?" Sarah shook her head. "Marcus is careful to keep his operations within state lines. His car dealerships are technically legal, even if some of his financing methods are questionable. He's never done anything that would attract federal attention." "Except assault and battery," Daniel pointed out. "Who's going to report it?" Sarah asked bitterly. "I never went to a hospital, never filed a police report. And his doctor friend would swear I was clumsy and accident-prone if anyone asked." Daniel absorbed this information, his expression growing darker. "What about family? Parents, siblings, anyone who might come looking for you independently?" "I grew up in foster care," Sarah said quietly. "No family to speak of. Marcus made sure to cut ties with the few friends I had after we got married. He's very thorough about eliminating outside influences." "So you're completely isolated," Daniel mused. "Classic abuser playbook. Make the victim dependent on you for everything, then convince everyone else that you're the reasonable one and she's unstable." The clinical accuracy of his assessment was both validating and terrifying. Sarah had lived the reality, but hearing it analyzed so precisely made her realize how trapped she'd truly been. "There's something else," she said reluctantly. "Marcus has a private investigator on retainer. Guy named Frank Russo, ex-cop, runs a security company now. He's the one who found me the other times I tried to leave." Daniel's attention sharpened. "Other times? I tried twice before," Sarah admitted. "Once about a year after we got married, before the violence really escalated. I made it to Billings before Russo tracked me down. The second time was just after I found out I was pregnant. I got as far as Spokane. What happened?" Sarah's voice dropped to a whisper. "Marcus had Russo bring me back both times. He said if I ever tried to leave again, he'd make sure I disappeared. Permanently. Said no one would look for a mentally unstable woman who'd already run away multiple times." Daniel was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. "How did Russo find you?" "Credit cards for the first time. I was naive enough to use them. The second time I used cash, but he tracked my car somehow. Marcus said he'd put some kind of GPS device in it. Modern vehicles have built-in tracking systems," Daniel said grimly. "If you know what you're doing, they're not hard to access. But you're not using credit cards or driving a car now. You're on foot in wilderness terrain. How could they possibly track you here?" As if summoned by his question, Thunder raised his head from his position by the fire, ears pricked and alert. The German shepherd moved to the window, staring out into the darkness with obvious agitation. Daniel was beside him instantly, peering through the glass at the moonlit forest. "Movement," he said quietly. "Someone's out there." Sarah felt the familiar ice of terror flood her veins. "How many?" "Can't tell yet. Thunder, stay." The dog remained at the window while Daniel moved to his gun cabinet. This time he withdrew not just a rifle, but a pistol and what looked like military-grade night vision equipment. "There's a root cellar under the kitchen," Daniel said, his voice shifting into the clipped efficiency of a soldier. "Hidden door beneath the cabinet. If shooting starts, you get down there and stay until I come for you." "What if you don't come back?" Sarah asked, hating how small her voice sounded. Daniel paused in his preparations. "Then you wait until dawn, take whatever supplies you can carry, and head north toward the Canadian border. There's a map in the cellar showing trails that don't appear on any official survey. Follow Glacier Creek upstream for 15 miles, then take the eastern fork. There's an old mining camp where you can shelter. The matter-of-fact way he outlined her escape plan drove home the reality of their situation. This wasn't paranoia or overcaution. They were genuinely under siege. Thunder's growl grew more pronounced, and Daniel raised the night vision scope to his eye. 4 men, he reported quietly. Moving in formation about 200 yards out. They've got professional gear, and they know what they're doing. Military? Sarah whispered. Mercenary, more likely. Russo's security company probably has ex-military. Contractors on payroll. Daniel moved away from the window, keeping low. They're setting up a perimeter. Classic search and seizure pattern. What do? We wait, Daniel said grimly. Let them make the first move and see what their intentions are. Maybe they're just here to observe and report back. That hope died when the first spotlight blazed to life, illuminating the front of the cabin in harsh white light. A voice boomed across the clearing, amplified by what sounded like a military-grade megaphone. Daniel Brooks. This is Frank Russo, representing Mitchell Automotive Group. We know you're harboring a missing person. Send Sarah Mitchell out and nobody gets hurt. Daniel's jaw tightened. So much for the element of surprise. How do they even know I'm here? Sarah asked desperately. Good question. Daniel was scanning the forest through his scope, tracking the positions of their attackers. Either someone talked or they've been watching the cabin longer than we realized. Another voice joined Russo's, one that made Sarah's blood freeze in her veins. Marcus himself was out there in the darkness. Sarah, honey, I know you can hear me. Her husband's voice carried easily across the clearing, warm and reasonable as always. You're sick, baby. You're not thinking clearly because of the pregnancy hormones. I've brought Dr. Reynolds with us. He's going to take good care of you and our baby. The mention of Dr. Reynolds, Marcus's golf buddy who'd helped cover up the abuse, confirmed Sarah's worst fears. This wasn't a rescue operation. It was a kidnapping with medical cover. Sarah, sweetheart, Marcus continued, his voice taking on the edge she knew all too well. You've worried me so much. I've been sick thinking about you and our child out here in the cold. Come out now and we can put this whole misunderstanding behind us. Daniel looked at her questioningly, and Sarah shook her head firmly. She knew that tone. Marcus was barely controlling his rage, and if she went with him willingly, the beating that awaited her would be worse than anything she'd endured before. She's not going anywhere, Daniel called back, his voice carrying easily across the clearing. Mr. Brooks, Russo's voice returned, harder now. You're interfering with a family matter. Mrs. Mitchell is mentally ill and potentially dangerous to herself and her unborn child. Her husband has legal authority to make medical decisions on her behalf. Then, bring a court order, Daniel replied. Until then, she's under my protection. The response was immediate and violent. Gunfire erupted from multiple positions, bullets shattering windows and splintering the wooden walls of the cabin. Daniel tackled Sarah to the floor, covering her body with his as glass rained down around them. Root cellar now, he shouted over the gunfire. Sarah crawled toward the kitchen while Daniel returned fire, his shots precise and measured. She found the hidden door exactly where he'd described it, a section of floorboard that lifted to reveal a ladder descending into darkness. As she climbed down into the cellar, Sarah could hear the battle raging above. Daniel's military training was evident in his controlled response to the attack, but he was outnumbered and surrounded. The cellar was larger than she'd expected, carved directly into the rock beneath the cabin, and stocked with supplies that suggested Daniel had been preparing for exactly this kind of siege: food, water, medical supplies, ammunition, and camping. Gear filled wooden shelves along the walls. A radio setup occupied one corner, And Sarah could see the map Daniel had mentioned, hand-drawn and marking trails that would be invisible to anyone who didn't know the mountains intimately. But what caught her attention was a smaller room branching off from the main cellar. Inside, she found something that explained how their attackers had found them so quickly: surveillance equipment, showing feeds from cameras positioned throughout the forest around the cabin. On the screens, Sarah could see their attackers clearly. For the first time, 4 men in tactical gear, moving with professional precision. Russo was older than she'd expected, perhaps 60, with gray hair and the bearing of a career law enforcement officer. The other 3 were younger, clearly military contractors hired for their specific skills, and there, directing operations. From behind an armored vehicle that had somehow made it up the mountain was Marcus. Even on the grainy surveillance footage, Sarah could see the cold fury in his expression. This wasn't about love or concern for his wife and child. This was about possession and control. The gunfire above intensified, and Sarah heard something that made her blood run cold: the sound of splintering wood as someone tried to break down the front door. Daniel was holding them off, but for how long? Then she heard Daniel's voice, closer than expected. He was at the top of the cellar stairs. "Sarah, they're using tear gas. I'm coming down." Daniel dropped into the cellar, his shirt torn and a fresh cut bleeding on his forehead. "They're trying to flush us out," he said grimly. "Professional operation, military-grade equipment. Your husband didn't just hire a private investigator. He hired a tactical team. What do we do now?" Sarah asked. Daniel moved to the surveillance monitors, studying their attackers' positions. "The tunnel," he said finally. "What tunnel?" "This cellar connects to an old mining shaft that comes out about half a mile north of here. It's how I've been getting supplies during winter without using the main trail." Daniel was already gathering equipment from the shelves. "We can slip out while they're focused on the cabin." "And then what? They'll just follow us." "Not if they think we're still inside." Daniel's smile was grim. "I've got some surprises prepared for unwelcome visitors. Military habits die hard." As if to emphasize his point, an explosion rocked the cabin above them, sending dust cascading from the ceiling. Whatever Daniel had rigged was beginning to activate. "Time to go," he said, shouldering a pack loaded with supplies. "The tunnel's narrow, but you should be able to manage it." "How are you feeling?" Sarah assessed her condition. The baby was active but not distressed, and adrenaline had given her energy she didn't know she possessed. "I can make it." "Good, because once we're in that tunnel, there's no going back. We come out the other side, or we don't come out at all." Daniel led her to what looked like a solid rock wall at the back of the cellar. But when he pressed against a specific section, part of the wall swung inward, revealing a narrow passage carved into the living rock. "Stay close," he said, switching on a small flashlight. "The path forks in a few places, and not all of them lead to safety." As they entered the tunnel, Sarah could hear the battle for the cabin intensifying above them. Explosions, gunfire, and shouted commands echoed through the mountain stone. But with each step deeper into the passage, the sounds grew fainter. "We're escaping," but Sarah knew this was far from over. Marcus had found them once in the most remote location imaginable. He had resources, connections, and a ruthless determination that wouldn't be deterred by a single tactical defeat. The tunnel stretched ahead into darkness, leading them deeper into the mountains and further from civilization. Behind them, the cabin that had been Sarah's sanctuary burned, filling the night sky with orange light. But for the first time since her flight began, Sarah wasn't running alone. And that made all the difference in the world. The mining tunnel stretched endlessly ahead, carved by desperate men chasing veins of silver that had played out decades before Sarah was born. The walls pressed close on either side, barely wide enough for Daniel's broad shoulders, and the ceiling forced him to walk in a permanent crouch that Sarah knew must be agony for his back. They'd been walking for over an hour when Sarah felt The first contraction. It started as a tightening across her lower abdomen. Not painful exactly, but unmistakably different from the baby's normal movements. She kept walking, hoping it was just stress or the awkward position required by the tunnel. But when the second one hit 20 minutes later, she could no longer deny what was happening. "Daniel," she said quietly, stopping in the narrow passage. Turned immediately, the flashlight beam illuminating her face. Whatever he saw there made his expression shift from concern to alarm. "What is it?" I think I might be having contractions." Daniel's jaw tightened. "How far apart?" "Maybe 20 minutes, I'm not sure. The first one could have been something else." "We need to get out of this tunnel," Daniel said grimly. "If you go into active labor in here, we're in serious trouble." They pushed forward with renewed urgency, the narrow passage seeming to stretch forever ahead of them. Sarah tried to focus on putting one foot in front of the other, but her mind kept racing with terrifying possibilities. She was still 2 months from her due date. Premature birth in the wilderness, with no medical facilities for hundreds of miles, could be fatal for both her and the baby. Another contraction hit as they reached a junction where the tunnel split in 3 directions. This one was stronger, forcing Sarah to brace herself against the rock wall until it passed. 15 minutes, she gasped when she could speak again. Daniel consulted a hand-drawn map, comparing it to markings carved into the tunnel wall. "We're close," he said. "The main exit is through the left passage, maybe another quarter mile." "What if they're watching the exit?" "Then we use one of the emergency routes," Daniel replied. "But let's hope it doesn't come to that. Some of those passages haven't been used in decades." The left tunnel began to slope upward, and Sarah could feel cool air moving against her face, the first hint that they were approaching the surface. But as they climbed, the contractions came more frequently. 12 minutes apart, then 10. Daniel noticed her increasingly labored breathing. "Sarah, talk to me. How bad is the pain?" "Manageable," she said, though sweat beaded her forehead despite the cool air, "but they're definitely getting stronger." "First babies usually take a long time," Daniel said, though his voice carried more hope than conviction. "We might have hours before things get serious." They emerged from the tunnel into a moonlit forest clearing dominated by the ruins of an old mining operation. Rusted equipment and collapsed buildings created an eerie landscape of industrial decay, slowly being reclaimed by the wilderness. Most importantly, there was no sign of Marcus or his tactical team. Daniel immediately began setting up a temporary camp behind the ruins of what had once been a processing building. The stone walls would provide both shelter and concealment, and the multiple escape routes through the surrounding forest gave them options if they were discovered. "How are you doing?" he asked as Sarah settled onto a sleeping bag he'd spread over the rocky ground. "The contractions are about 8 minutes apart now," she admitted. "And getting stronger." Daniel's expression grew serious. "Sarah, I need to ask you something, and I need a completely honest answer. Have you had any problems with this pregnancy? Anything that might indicate premature labor?" Sarah thought back to the months of controlled medical care under Marcus's supervision. "Dr. Reynolds said everything was normal at my last appointment. But that was 3 weeks ago, and Marcus was always in the room, so I'm not sure how honest the doctor was being." "What about bleeding, cramping, anything unusual in the past few days?" "No bleeding," Sarah said. "But I've had back pain and some cramping since we left the cabin. I thought it was just from all the walking and stress." Daniel nodded grimly. Stress can definitely trigger early labor. The physical exertion, the fear, the violence you witnessed, all of that could have started this process. Another contraction hit, stronger than the previous ones. Sarah found herself gripping Daniel's hand without conscious thought, squeezing until the pain subsided. 6 minutes, she gasped. Daniel was quiet for a moment, clearly running calculations in his head. "We need to make a decision," he said finally. "If this is real labor, We're looking at hours of increasingly intense contractions followed by delivery. Out here in February, with no medical support. What's the alternative? There's a ranger station about 15 miles south of here. Radio, medical supplies, probably a helicopter landing pad for emergency evacuations. Sarah's initial surge of hope died as she considered the implications. But that means going back toward Marcus. And if we radio for help, he'll intercept the communications, Daniel finished. Your husband has enough resources to monitor emergency frequencies. We'd be leading them right to us, so what do you recommend? Daniel studied her face in the moonlight. Honestly, I think we should head for the ranger station. A premature birth in the wilderness is extremely dangerous, even with my medical training. At the ranger station, we'd have real medical supplies and the possibility of helicopter evacuation to a hospital. And Marcus? We deal with that problem when we come to it. Right now, keeping you and the baby alive is the priority. Sarah felt another contraction building and focused on breathing through it. When it passed, she looked at Daniel with new resolve. No, she said firmly. Sarah ... No, she repeated. I've spent 3 years living in fear of that man. I've let him control every aspect of my life, including my medical care. I won't give him the chance to take my baby. This isn't about pride or independence, Daniel said gently. This is about survival. Exactly, Sarah replied. If we go to that ranger station, Marcus will be there within hours. He'll have legal documents declaring me mentally incompetent, medical justification for taking custody of the baby, and enough political influence to make it all look legitimate. I'll disappear into some private facility where he controls everything. And my child will grow up thinking their mother abandoned them. Daniel absorbed this, clearly torn between medical necessity and understanding her perspective. There's another option, Sarah continued. You said you were a combat medic. You've delivered babies before. In field conditions, yes. But Sarah, combat medicine is about keeping people alive long enough to get them to real medical care. What you're talking about is delivering a premature baby in the wilderness with whatever supplies we can carry. Can it be done? Daniel was quiet for a long time. Maybe, he said finally. If everything goes perfectly. If there are no complications. If the baby is developed enough to survive outside the womb. That's a lot of ifs. But it's possible. Theoretically, yes, but the risks are mine to take, Sarah finished. This is my choice, Daniel. For the first time in 3 years, I get to make a decision about my own body and my own child. Please don't take that away from me. Another contraction hit before Daniel could respond, and this one was noticeably stronger. Sarah found herself making involuntary sounds of pain despite her efforts to remain quiet. 5 minutes, she breathed when it passed. Daniel's expression shifted into the focused calm of a medic facing a crisis. Okay, he said. If we're doing this, we do it right. First, we need better shelter. There's an old cabin about 2 miles from here, one of the mining company's supervisor quarters. It's been abandoned for years, but the structure should be sound. Can I make it 2 miles? We'll take it slow and stop whenever you need to. The important thing is getting you somewhere warm and enclosed before active labor begins. They packed quickly, Daniel loading his backpack with medical supplies while Sarah tried to time her contractions. The interval was definitely shortening, and the intensity was increasing in a way that felt inevitable and frightening. The hike to the abandoned cabin was a nightmare of pain and endurance. Every few minutes, Sarah would have to stop and brace herself against a tree or rock while another contraction rolled through her. Daniel stayed close, offering support and encouragement, but she could see the worry in his eyes growing with each episode. The cabin, when they finally reached it, was a small log structure with a stone chimney and surprisingly intact windows. The interior was dusty and filled with old mining equipment, but the roof was solid and the walls would keep out the wind. Daniel immediately began preparing the space, clearing out debris and setting up their sleeping bags near the fireplace. From his pack, he pulled out medical supplies that Sarah hadn't known he was carrying: sterile gloves, antiseptic, clean towels, and what looked like a basic surgical kit. "Where did all this come from?" she asked during a brief respite between contractions. "I told you I was paranoid," Daniel replied, building a fire in the stone hearth. "When you live alone in the wilderness, you prepare for every possible emergency, including medical ones. Have you ever actually delivered a baby?" Daniel paused in his fire building. "3 times in Afghanistan, all in less than ideal circumstances. 2 of them made it." The honesty of his answer was both reassuring and terrifying. At least he had experience, but the failure rate was sobering. As the fire began to warm the small cabin, Sarah felt another contraction building. This one was different, longer, stronger, and accompanied by pressure she hadn't felt before. "Daniel," she said urgently. He was beside her immediately, checking his watch and studying her face. "How long was that one?" "I don't know. Longer. And there's pressure. Down there." Daniel's expression grew serious. "Sarah, I need to examine you to see how far along you are. Is that okay?" She nodded, and Daniel helped her into a position where he could assess her condition. His examination was quick and professional, but when he finished, his face was grim. "You're in active labor," he said quietly. "Probably been progressing faster than we realized because of the stress and exertion." "How much longer?" "Hard to say. With a first baby. Could be hours, could be much sooner." "But Sarah, there's something else. The baby's position isn't ideal. It's a breach." Sarah felt ice flood her veins. Even with her limited medical knowledge, she knew that breech births were dangerous under the best circumstances. In a wilderness cabin with minimal medical supplies, it could be fatal. "What does that mean?" she asked, though she was afraid she already knew. "It means the baby is coming feet first instead of head first," Daniel explained gently. "It's more complicated, takes longer, and carries higher risks for both mother and child. But you can handle it?" Daniel met her eyes directly. "I'm going to do everything I can to bring both of you through this safely. But I want you to understand the risks. Breech delivery can cause cord compression, bleeding, and other complications that I'm not equipped to handle out here." Sarah felt another massive contraction building and gripped Daniel's hand as it crashed over her. When it passed, she looked at him with fierce determination. "We've come this far," she said. "We're not giving up now." Outside the cabin, wind howled through the mountains, and snow began to fall again. Inside, by the light of a single fire, a desperate woman and a damaged soldier prepared to bring new life into a world that seemed determined to destroy it. The real battle was just beginning. Labor progressed with relentless intensity through the long mountain night. Sarah lost track of time as waves of pain crashed over her, each contraction stronger and longer than the last. Daniel worked tirelessly, monitoring her condition, adjusting her position, and preparing for the complicated breech delivery they both knew was coming. "You're doing incredible," he murmured during a brief respite between contractions. "Stronger than most soldiers I've worked with." Sarah managed a weak smile. "I don't feel strong. I feel like I'm being torn apart." "That's exactly what's happening," Daniel said with brutal honesty. "Your body is working harder than it ever has in your life, but it's working correctly. Everything I'm seeing suggests you and the baby are handling this as well as possible. Under the circumstances." Another contraction built, and Sarah found herself making sounds she didn't recognize. Primal, animal noises that seemed to come from some deep part of herself she'd never accessed before. The pain was beyond anything she'd imagined, making Marcus's worst beatings seem minor by comparison. "I can see the feet," Daniel announced suddenly. "Sarah, your baby is coming. On the next contraction, I need you to push as hard as you can." The Instruction seemed impossible. Sarah felt like she'd been pushing for hours already, her body working beyond her conscious control. But when the next wave hit, she bore down with everything she had left. Good. I've got the legs now. The body is coming. Daniel's hands moved with practiced efficiency, supporting the emerging infant while carefully managing the umbilical cord. Sarah could see the intense concentration on his face, the combat medic taking over completely. One more big push for the shoulders, he said. This is the critical moment. Sarah pushed until she saw stars, her vision graying at the edges. Then suddenly, the pressure was gone, replaced by an overwhelming sense of emptiness and relief. You did it, Daniel said, his voice filled with wonder. Sarah, you have a daughter. The baby's cry filled the cabin, weak but unmistakably alive. Daniel worked quickly, clearing the infant's airway and wrapping her in clean towels. Even in the firelight, Sarah could see how small she was, clearly premature but breathing on her own. Is she? Sarah couldn't finish the question. She's beautiful, Daniel said softly, placing the tiny bundle on Sarah's chest. Small, but her color's good, and her breathing is strong. She's a fighter, just like her mother. Sarah looked down at her daughter for the first time, overwhelmed by a love so fierce it took her breath away. The baby was indeed tiny, probably. Barely 5 pounds, but perfect in every detail Sarah could see. Dark hair covered her head, and when she opened her eyes, they were a startling shade of blue-gray. Hello, little one, Sarah whispered, tears streaming down her face. I'm your mama. I'm so sorry it had to be like this. The moment of peace was shattered by the sound Daniel had been dreading. Helicopters approaching from the south. Multiple aircraft, flying in formation with searchlights sweeping the forest below. They found us, Daniel said grimly, moving to the window. 3 helicopters, military configuration. They're setting up a search pattern. Sarah's blood ran cold. Even in the aftermath of giving birth, with her daughter only minutes old, Marcus was still hunting them. The man's obsession knew no bounds. How long do we have? She asked. Daniel studied the search pattern through the cabin's single window. They're working systematically, but they don't know exactly where we are yet. Maybe an hour before they reach this area. Can we move with the baby? Not far, not fast. You just gave birth. You need time to recover. Before any kind of travel, and the baby needs to stay warm. Moving her out into the February cold could be fatal. As if to emphasize his point, another helicopter passed overhead, its searchlight briefly illuminating the cabin before moving on. They were getting closer. There might be another option, Daniel said slowly. The old mine shaft behind this cabin connects to a deeper tunnel system. Some of those passages lead to natural caves that would be invisible from the air and warm enough to shelter in. But they're unmapped. I've never explored them fully. We could get lost, trapped, or worse. It would be a desperate gamble. Sarah looked down at her daughter, who had quieted and seemed to be sleeping peacefully despite the chaos around them. The thought of taking a newborn into unknown cave systems was terrifying, but the alternative was worse. Marcus will never stop, she said quietly. If he finds us here, he'll take her. He'll claim I'm mentally unstable from childbirth trauma, and no court in Montana will side with me over him. Sarah, those caves could be dangerous. Unstable rock, underground streams, dead ends. If we get trapped down there, then at least we'll be free when we die, Sarah replied with sudden fierce clarity. I won't let him have her, Daniel. I won't. Let my daughter grow up thinking her mother didn't fight for her. Daniel absorbed this, clearly weighing impossible choices. Outside, the helicopter sounds grew louder and more coordinated. Time was running out. All right, he said finally. But we do this my way. I go first, make sure the passages are safe. You stay here with the baby until I can confirm we have a viable route. And if those helicopters find me while you're gone? Then you hide in the mine entrance and wait for me to come back. Don't try to navigate those caves alone. You'll get lost and die. Daniel quickly gathered essential supplies: water, medical kit, flashlights, and clean blankets for the baby. He also took something else from his pack that Sarah hadn't seen before: a handheld radio. Emergency frequency, he explained. If something happens to me, if I don't come back, you use this to call for help. Tell them you're a pregnant woman in distress and give them these coordinates. He handed her a slip of paper with numbers written on it. What about Marcus? Let me worry about Marcus. Your job is to keep yourself and that baby alive. Daniel kissed Sarah's forehead gently, then looked down at the sleeping infant. Take care of your mama, little one. She's the bravest person I've ever met. He disappeared into the mine entrance behind the cabin, leaving Sarah alone with her newborn daughter and the growing sound of approaching helicopters. She used the time to rest and bond with the baby, marveling at the tiny fingers and perfect features that somehow made all the pain and terror worthwhile. 20 minutes later, Daniel returned with news that was both encouraging and terrifying. I found a route, he said. 3 connected caves about half a mile into the mountain. Their warm geothermal activity keeps them above freezing year-round. Fresh water, multiple entrances, and completely hidden from aerial surveillance. What's the bad news? The passage to get there is narrow and requires crawling for about 200 yards, with a newborn baby. Sarah looked down at her daughter, now nursing contentedly despite being born into such chaos. The thought of crawling through tight spaces while protecting a fragile infant was terrifying, but the alternatives were worse. When do we leave? Now, Daniel said urgently. The search pattern is closing in, and I can hear vehicles on the access roads. They're coordinating ground and air assets. Daniel helped Sarah to her feet, supporting her when her legs nearly gave out. The aftermath of childbirth had left her weak and shaky, but adrenaline provided strength she didn't know she possessed. They made it to the mine entrance, just as searchlights swept across the cabin they'd abandoned. Sarah clutched her daughter close to her chest, whispering reassurances she wasn't sure she believed herself. The crawl through the narrow passage was a nightmare of claustrophobia and terror. Sarah had to inch forward on her belly, using her arms to pull herself along while protecting the baby with her body. Behind her, Daniel pushed their supplies and provided encouragement, but she could hear the strain in his voice. Almost there, he said when Sarah was sure she couldn't continue. 50 more yards. The cave system Daniel had found was indeed a miracle. 3 large chambers connected by wide passages, warmed by underground springs and completely invisible from the surface. The main chamber had a small pool of clear, drinkable water and enough space to set up a comfortable camp. This is incredible, Sarah breathed, settling onto a bed of blankets Daniel had prepared. How did you know about this? I didn't, Daniel admitted. I've been exploring these mountains for 5 years, but I'd never been this deep in the cave system. We got lucky. Outside their hidden sanctuary, they could hear the search intensifying. Helicopters circled overhead, and vehicle engines echoed through the mountain valleys. But inside the caves, they were invisible and safe. How long can we stay here? Sarah asked. As long as we need to, Daniel replied. There's water. I can hunt for food when things calm down, and the caves will stay warm all winter. Your daughter could grow up here if necessary. The thought was both comforting and sobering. Sarah had escaped Marcus's control, but at the cost of any normal life for herself or her child. Still, as she looked down at her sleeping daughter, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't experienced in years. What do we call her? Daniel asked softly. She needs a name. Sarah had thought about this moment for months, but Marcus had insisted on controlling even this decision. Now, for the first time, the choice was entirely hers. Hope, she said finally. Her name is Hope. Daniel smiled. Perfect. Hope Brooks has a nice ring to it. Brooks? If she's going to grow up in the wilderness, she need a father figure. I'm volunteering for the job if you'll have me. Sarah felt tears streaming down her face again, but these were tears of joy rather than pain. After years of isolation and abuse, she'd found not just safety, but family in the most unlikely place. Daniel. Brooks, she said softly, I would be honored to have you as Hope's father. Outside their cave sanctuary, Marcus's search continued through the night. But inside, 3 people who had been broken by life began the slow process of healing together. They were no longer running. They were home. And for the first time since her nightmare began, Sarah believed they might actually survive. 3 weeks passed in the hidden cave system before Sarah realized they were no longer just surviving. They were thriving. The caves had become a sanctuary where her daughter Hope grew stronger each day, where her own body healed from the trauma of childbirth and years of abuse, and where Daniel transformed from a damaged soldier into the gentle father figure he'd promised to become. The main chamber had evolved into a comfortable living space. Daniel had constructed furniture from salvaged mine timbers, created a ventilation system that kept the air fresh, and even rigged a lighting system using LED lanterns. Powered by a small solar panel he retrieved during nighttime, forays to the surface. Hope was proving to be a remarkably adaptable baby. Despite her premature birth and chaotic arrival, she was gaining weight steadily and showing all the signs of healthy development. Her eyes had settled into the same storm gray color as Daniel's, a coincidence that never failed to make Sarah smile. She's going to be tall, Daniel observed one morning as he helped Sarah bathe the baby in the warm spring water. Look at the length of those legs. She gets that from you, Sarah said without thinking, then blushed at the implication. Daniel's smile was warm and understanding. Well, she's definitely not getting it from either of her biological parents. Sometimes families are created by choice rather than genetics. The casual way he'd accepted his role as Hope's father still amazed Sarah. There had been no formal discussion, no negotiation of terms. Daniel had simply stepped into the role and filled it completely, taking midnight feedings so Sarah could rest, singing lullabies in his deep voice when Hope was fussy, and showing a patience with infant care that seemed to come naturally despite his intimidating appearance. But their peaceful existence was shattered on a Thursday morning when Daniel returned from a supply run with news that changed everything. Marcus is gone, he announced without preamble. Sarah looked up from where she was nursing, Hope confusion clear on her face. What do you mean gone? I mean he's not in Montana anymore. I picked up radio chatter from the search teams. They're scaling back operations. Apparently, your husband received an urgent business call 3 days ago and flew to Seattle on some kind of deal that couldn't wait. Sarah felt a complex mixture of relief and suspicion. That doesn't sound like Marcus. He's never let business interfere with something he really wanted. That's what I thought too, Daniel agreed. So I did some more reconnaissance. Climbed high enough to get cell phone reception and did some research on my smartphone. Sarah raised an eyebrow. She'd begun to think of their cave system as completely isolated from the modern world. Marcus Mitchell sold his entire chain of car dealerships 4 days ago, Daniel continued. Sold them to a corporate buyer out of Denver for what? The business journals are calling an undisclosed sum, but the speculation is somewhere north of $50 million. $50 million? Sarah couldn't process the number. She'd known Marcus was wealthy, but not that wealthy. It gets stranger. He's also liquidated most of his other Montana assets, real estate, investments, even his political contributions to local campaigns. Everything suggests he's preparing to leave the state permanently. Sarah's mind raced through the implications. He's running. But why? And why now? I have a theory about that, Daniel said grimly. I think your disappearance created problems for him that he didn't anticipate. Think about it. A prominent businessman's pregnant wife vanishes without a trace. There's a massive search operation involving helicopters and tactical teams. And then suddenly, he abandons everything and flees the state. You think people started asking questions? I think people started looking into his background more closely than he was comfortable with. Abusers like Marcus depend on maintaining a public image of respectability. When that image starts to crack, their whole world can come apart very quickly. Sarah absorbed this information, trying to decide how she felt about it. Part of her was relieved that the immediate threat was gone, but another part felt cheated of some kind of resolution. So what happens now? She asked. Now we have choices, Daniel replied. Real choices for the first time since this all started. What kind of choices? Daniel settled beside her, his expression serious but hopeful. We could stay here. I've proven we can live comfortably in these caves, and hope seems to be thriving in this environment. We'd be completely off the grid, completely safe, and completely free. Or we could leave. With Marcus gone and his resources no longer focused on finding you, we could start over somewhere else. New identities, new lives, but in the regular world instead of hidden underground. Sarah looked down at Hope, who had finished nursing and was now sleeping peacefully in her arms. The baby looked so content, so perfectly adapted to their unusual circumstances, that the thought of disrupting her routine seemed almost cruel. What do you want to do? She asked Daniel. I want whatever makes you and Hope happiest, he replied without hesitation. I've been alone for 5 years, and these past 3 weeks with you two have been the best of my life. Whether that's here, in these caves, or somewhere else, entirely doesn't matter to me. The sincerity in his voice brought tears to Sarah's eyes. After years of Marcus's manipulation and control, Daniel's selfless devotion still seemed too good to be true. I need to think about it, she said finally. Of course, there's no rush. We're safe here for as long as we want to stay. But as the days passed, Sarah found herself increasingly conflicted about their future. The caves had become a home in ways she hadn't expected, but they were also a prison of sorts. Hope would never have playmates here, never attend school, never experience the normal milestones of childhood. Sarah herself was healing from her trauma, but was hiding underground really the same as recovery? The decision was made for them a week later when Daniel discovered something during one of his nighttime supply runs. We have visitors, he announced upon returning to the caves before dawn. Sarah's blood ran cold. Marcus? No, FBI. The word hung in the air like a physical presence. Sarah had never considered that federal law enforcement might become involved in her disappearance. How many? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. 2 agents that I could see, plus some local support. They've set up a command post at the old ranger station, and they're conducting what looks like a very methodical investigation. Investigation of what? Daniel's expression was grim. From what I could overhear, they're looking into Marcus's business dealings. Apparently, your disappearance triggered some kind of federal inquiry into his operations. Sarah felt a strange mixture of vindication and terror. She'd always suspected that Marcus's business practices weren't entirely legal, but she'd never had proof or the courage to act on her suspicions. What kind of business dealings? Money laundering, from what I could gather. Using the car dealerships to clean money for some pretty unsavory characters. The working theory seems to be that you discovered something you shouldn't have, and Marcus either killed you or had you killed to keep you quiet. The irony was staggering. Sarah had fled from Marcus to save her life, and now the authorities thought he'd already taken it. Do they have evidence? They seem to think they do. I heard them talking about financial records, suspicious transactions, and witness testimony from former employees. Apparently, once people realized Marcus was gone, some of them became very talkative about things they'd seen over the years. Sarah processed this information, trying to understand what it meant for their situation. So if the FBI thinks I'm dead, Then Sarah Mitchell is officially gone, Daniel finished. Which means you're free to become someone else entirely. But what about justice? If Marcus really was involved in money laundering, shouldn't he face consequences? Daniel was quiet for a long moment. Sarah, I need to tell you something about justice. In my experience, it's a luxury that survivors can't always afford. Sometimes the best justice is simply outliving your enemies and building a better life despite them. But if I have information that could help the investigation, Do you actually know anything concrete about Marcus's business practices, or do you just suspect? Sarah thought back through 3 years of marriage, trying to remember specific details rather than general impressions. I overheard phone calls sometimes. Names I didn't recognize, references to cleaning money. But nothing specific enough to be useful in court. And even if you did have useful information, think about what testifying would mean. You'd have to reveal that you're alive, which means giving up the new life we've built. You'd have to face Marcus again, probably in a courtroom where his lawyers would do everything possible to discredit you. And you'd have to explain why you faked your own death instead of going to the police. The reality of Daniel's words was sobering. Sarah had dreamed of seeing Marcus face justice for his crimes, but the cost of making that happen might be higher than she was willing to pay. There's something else, Daniel continued. Something I haven't told you yet. Sarah braced herself for more complications. I've been monitoring law enforcement communications for weeks now. Yesterday, I picked up something interesting. The Seattle Police Department issued a BOLO alert for Marcus Mitchell. BOLO? Be on the lookout. Apparently, Marcus has disappeared from Seattle too. His hotel room was found empty 3 days ago, with signs of a struggle. His rental car was discovered abandoned at the Canadian border. Sarah felt the world shift around her. He's running from the FBI investigation? Or he's been eliminated by the people he was laundering money for, Daniel said grimly. When money launderers become liabilities, they tend to have short life expectancies. The possibility that Marcus might be dead created a complex storm of emotions in Sarah's chest. Relief, guilt, vindication, and sadness all competed for dominance. How do you feel about that? Daniel asked gently. I don't know, Sarah admitted. I spent so long being afraid of him that I'm not sure how to process the idea that he might be gone forever. You don't have to process it all at once, Daniel assured her. But it does change our options significantly. How? If Marcus is dead or permanently missing, then the immediate threat to you and hope is gone. We could emerge from hiding, create new identities, and start over anywhere we want. The FBI investigation will eventually close, and Sarah Mitchell will remain officially missing, presumed dead. Sarah looked around the cave that had become her sanctuary, then down at Hope sleeping in her makeshift crib. The baby had never known any world beyond these stone walls, but she was growing rapidly and would soon need more space to explore and develop. Where would we go? She asked. Anywhere, Daniel replied with a smile. We could head north to Canada, south to Mexico, or anywhere in between. With new identities and the skills I've learned living off the grid, we could disappear completely and build whatever kind of life we want. The freedom inherent in that possibility was both exhilarating and terrifying. After years of having every decision controlled by Marcus, the idea of unlimited choices was overwhelming. I want to see the outside world again, Sarah said finally. I want Hope to grow up with other children, to go to school, to have normal experiences. But I also want to stay safe. We can have both, Daniel assured her. It just requires careful planning and patience. That night, as Sarah lay in the darkness listening to Hope's peaceful breathing and Daniel's steady heartbeat beside her, she made her decision. They would leave the caves and venture back into the world, but they would do it on their own terms, The underground empire they'd built would always be their sanctuary, but it was time to claim the surface world as well. Transformation began with documents. Daniel had contacts from his military days, people who specialized in creating new identities for those who needed to disappear. Within 2 weeks of making their decision to leave the caves, packages began arriving at a post office box in a town 50 miles away. Dropped off by intermediaries who asked no questions and left no traces. Sarah Elizabeth Williams became Rebecca Ann Foster, a widow from Oregon whose husband had died in a logging accident. Daniel Michael Brooks became David Foster, Rebecca's brother-in-law who had stepped in to help raise his deceased brother's child. Hope became Emma Foster, a healthy baby girl born in a home birth to parents who valued privacy over paperwork. The backstory needs to be simple, Daniel explained. As they reviewed their new documents in the warmth of their cave sanctuary, the more complicated the lie, the easier it is to trip up on details. We're a small family who lost someone important and decided to start fresh somewhere new. Sarah studied her new driver's license, credit cards, and social security documentation. The quality was flawless. These weren't amateur forgeries, but professional work that would pass any standard background check. "How much did this cost?" she asked. "Don't worry about the money," Daniel replied. "I had savings from my military service, plus some investments that did well while I was living off the grid. We have enough to start over comfortably." "But Daniel, I can't let you spend your life savings on us. Rebecca," he said gently, using her new name for the first time. "We're a family now. My resources are our resources, just like my future is tied to yours and Emma's." The use of their new identities felt strange but liberating. Sarah, Rebecca, had to consciously remind herself to respond to the unfamiliar name, but each time she did, she felt another layer of Marcus's control falling away. They spent another month in the caves, practicing their new identities and planning their emergence into the world. Daniel scouted potential destinations, looking for places where a small family could blend in without attracting attention. He also continued monitoring law enforcement communications, tracking the ongoing investigations into both Marcus's disappearance and his alleged criminal activities. The news was consistently encouraging. Marcus remained missing, with most law enforcement agencies now treating his case as either a voluntary flight from justice or elimination by criminal associates. The FBI's financial investigation had expanded far beyond Marcus's operations, revealing a network of money laundering activities that spanned multiple states and involved dozens of suspects. He was apparently a much smaller fish than any of us realized, Daniel reported after one of his information-gathering expeditions. "The FBI is calling him a mid-level facilitator, not a mastermind. Just someone who got in over his head and became a liability." Sarah felt an unexpected pang of something that might have been pity. For all his cruelty and control, Marcus had ultimately been just another criminal who'd overestimated his own importance and paid the price for it. "Do they have any leads on where he might be?" "Officially, the investigation remains active. Unofficially, I get the impression they expect to find his body eventually. People who launder money for drug cartels don't usually get retirement packages when they become inconvenient." The finality of this assessment was sobering but also freeing. If Marcus was truly gone, then the threat that had driven Sarah into the wilderness was eliminated. Hope would never have to fear her biological father's influence or control. Their destination, when they finally chose one, surprised Sarah with its ordinariness. Daniel had selected Asheville, North Carolina, a mid-sized city nestled in the Seal Blue Ridge Mountains, known for its arts community, outdoor recreation opportunities, and generally accepting attitude toward people who valued privacy. "It's big enough that we won't stand out, but small enough that we can build real connections," Daniel explained. "Good schools for Emma when she's older. Plenty of outdoor space for someone who spent time living in the wilderness, and far enough from Montana that no one's likely to recognize us from old news reports. The logistics of leaving their underground sanctuary were more complex than Sarah had anticipated. They couldn't simply pack up and drive away. Too many government agencies were still monitoring the area around Marcus's last known location. Instead, Daniel orchestrated a careful extraction that took place over several nights. First, he moved their essential belongings to a cache point several miles from the caves, using routes that avoided all known surveillance positions. Then, on a moonless night when weather conditions grounded most aircraft, a contact from Daniel's military network arrived with a nondescript van and no questions asked. Sarah's last look at the cave system that had been their home filled her with unexpected sadness. These stone chambers had witnessed Hope's first weeks of life, Sarah's recovery from years of abuse, and the formation of a family bond stronger than anything biology could have created. Leaving felt like abandoning a piece of themselves. "We can always come back," Daniel said softly, understanding her emotions without need for explanation. "This place will always be here if we need it." The drive to North Carolina took 3 days. With careful route planning to avoid toll roads, traffic cameras, and other potential points of tracking. They stopped only at small cash-only establishments and never stayed in the same area for more than a few hours. Hope handled the travel remarkably well, sleeping peacefully in her car seat and adapting to the constant motion with the flexibility that seemed to characterize everything about her young life. Sarah found herself marveling at her daughter's resilience, born in a wilderness cabin, raised in mountain caves, and now beginning a cross-country journey at barely 2 months old. "She's going to be extraordinary," Daniel observed during one of their brief stops. "Most babies would be traumatized by this kind of upheaval, but look at her. She's thriving on adventure." "She gets that from you," Sarah replied, echoing her earlier comment, but with deeper meaning now. In every way that mattered, Daniel had become Hope's father, and his calm strength was clearly influencing the baby's development. Asheville welcomed them with autumn colors and mountain air that reminded Sarah of Montana without triggering the traumatic associations. Daniel had arranged for them to rent a small house in a quiet neighborhood, nothing fancy, but clean and safe with a yard where Hope could eventually play. The house came furnished with basics, and within a week, they'd transformed it into something that felt remarkably like home. Daniel set up a woodworking shop in the basement, returning to the crafts that had helped him heal during his years of isolation. Sarah began exploring the possibility of remote work, freelance editing and writing that would allow her to earn income while staying home with Hope. "It's strange," Sarah confided one evening as they sat on the front porch watching the sunset over the mountains. "I feel like I should be more nervous about being in the open like this." "But you're not?" Daniel asked. "I'm not. For the first time in years, I feel normal, like we're just a regular family living a regular life." "Maybe because that's exactly what we are now," Daniel suggested. "Rebecca Foster is not running from anyone. She's a widow starting over with help from her brother-in-law. There's nothing suspicious or unusual about that." The normalcy extended to small daily routines that Sarah had forgotten could exist without fear. Grocery shopping without checking over her shoulder. Taking Hope for walks without worrying about being recognized. Chatting with neighbors without calculating every word for potential danger. The transformation was most apparent in Sarah's relationship with Hope. Without the constant stress of hiding and survival, she could focus completely on being a mother. She read to Hope for hours, sang lullabies her own foster mothers had taught her, and began planning for all the experiences she wanted her daughter to have. Daniel's integration into their family life continued to amaze Sarah with its naturalness. He took night feedings without being asked, baby-proofed the house before Hope was even mobile, and spent hours talking to her in the gentle voice he seemed to reserve exclusively for his adopted daughter. "Have you thought about making this official?" Sarah asked one evening after watching Daniel expertly handle Hope's bath time routine. What is official? The adoption. Your legal rights as her father. Daniel paused in his careful drying of Hope's tiny feet. I hadn't really considered the legal aspects. I guess I just assumed that biology didn't matter when it came to real family. It doesn't, Sarah assured him. But legal protection might matter if anything ever happened to me. Right now, you have no official standing as her father. If something went wrong, the state could take her away from the only father she's ever known. The conversation led to research into North Carolina, adoption laws, and the discovery that Daniel could indeed adopt Hope legally. As her mother's unmarried partner taking on a parental role, the process would be straightforward, especially with no biological father in the picture to contest the adoption. David Foster adopting Emma Foster, Daniel mused. It has a nice ring to it. The legal proceedings took several months, but when the adoption was finalized, Sarah felt a sense of completeness she hadn't realized she'd been missing. Their family was now official in every sense that mattered. Hope's first birthday arrived with spring flowers and a celebration that would have been impossible in their previous life. Daniel built her elaborate wooden playground set in the backyard, while Sarah invited neighbors and new friends they'd made in Asheville. Watching Hope take her first tentative steps across the grass, surrounded by people who knew them only as the Foster family, Sarah felt tears of joy streaming down her face. Happy? Daniel asked, wrapping his arms around her as they watched their daughter explore her new world. Happier than I ever thought possible, Sarah replied honestly. Sometimes I can barely remember what it felt like to be afraid all the time. Good, Daniel said firmly. Fear was never supposed to be your natural state. This is who you really are, strong, confident, and free. As Hope toddled around the yard, babbling in the mixture of sounds and syllables that would soon become words, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. A year ago, she'd been a terrified pregnant woman fleeing into the wilderness with no plan beyond survival. Now she was a confident mother watching her daughter's first steps in the safety of their own backyard. The transformation felt miraculous, but Sarah was beginning to understand that it hadn't been. It had been a choice. The choice to run when staying meant death. The choice to trust a stranger who offered help. The choice to bring new life into the world under impossible circumstances. The choice to build a family based on love rather than biology. Mama. Hope's first clear word rang across the yard, and Sarah's heart swelled with pride and joy. Double quotes, yes, baby girl, she called back. Mama's here. Mama and Daddy are both here, and we always will be. In the distance, the Blue Ridge Mountains stood eternal and protective, sheltering a family that had been forged in crisis, but had chosen to thrive in peace. The woman who had once been Sarah Mitchell was gone forever, but Rebecca Foster was just beginning to discover what life could be when fear was replaced by love. And in that discovery, she found something she'd never dared to dream of, true happiness, built on a foundation of choice, courage, and the unbreakable bonds of chosen family. 5 years later, Sarah stood at the kitchen window of their expanded home, watching Hope chase butterflies through the garden Daniel had built for them. At 6 years old, Hope was everything Sarah had dreamed of, confident, curious, and completely unafraid of the world around her. She attended the local elementary school, played soccer with neighborhood friends, and called Daniel Daddy with the unconscious certainty of a child who had never known any other father. Rebecca? Daniel's voice came from behind her, using the name that had become as natural as breathing. You're doing that thing where you get lost in thought. Sarah turned to find her husband. They'd married 3 years ago, in a simple ceremony in their backyard, holding a letter with an expression she couldn't quite read. What is it? She asked, noting the official letterhead. News from Montana, Daniel said carefully. The final closure of the Marcus Mitchell case. Sarah's stomach tightened slightly. Even after all these years, mentions of her former life could still create echoes of old anxiety. They found him? They found remains, confirmed through DNA testing. He's been dead for over 4 years, probably killed within weeks of his disappearance from Seattle. Sarah absorbed this information, surprised by how little it affected her emotionally. Marcus Mitchell felt like a character from someone else's story now, a villain from a book she'd read long ago. "How do I feel about that?" she asked, more to herself than to Daniel. "Only you can answer that question," Daniel replied gently. "But I'll say this, you survived him. You built a life he could never have imagined for you. You raised a daughter who will never know fear the way you did. That's victory in every sense that matters." Through the window, Hope's laughter rang out as she successfully caught a monarch butterfly, examined it with gentle curiosity, then carefully released it back into the garden. The sight filled Sarah with a profound sense of completion. I feel relieved," she said finally. "Not because he's dead, but because it's finally over. Really, truly over." Daniel wrapped his arms around her from behind, and Sarah leaned into his strength, the way she had countless times over the past 6 years. Their love story hadn't begun with romance or passion. It had started with survival and grown into something deeper and more lasting than anything she'd thought possible. "Speaking of things being over," Daniel said, his voice taking on a teasing tone, "I have another piece of news." "Oh? I got a call from that publisher in New York. They want to offer you a book contract." Sarah's breath caught. She'd been working on a novel for the past 2 years, a story about resilience, and found a family that drew from her experiences without revealing them. The therapeutic value of writing had surprised her, but she'd never imagined it might lead to publication. A real contract? With real money? Real enough that you could quit freelance editing if you wanted to focus on writing full-time. The possibility was dizzying. Sarah had discovered a talent for storytelling that she'd never known she possessed, and the idea of supporting her family through her creativity felt like another kind of freedom. "What does Hope think about having a famous author for a mom?" Sarah asked. "She thinks you're already famous," Daniel replied with a laugh. "Last week, she told her teacher that her mom was the best storyteller in the whole world because you made up bedtime stories that were better than any book." The comment brought tears to Sarah's eyes. Hope's childhood was everything Sarah had wanted it to be, filled with security, love, and the absolute certainty that she was cherished exactly as she was. A crash from the yard interrupted their conversation, followed by Hope's voice calling out, "I'm okay." Just fell down chasing Mr. Whiskers. They rushed outside to find Hope brushing dirt off her clothes while their cat, Mr. Whiskers, sat nearby with the smugly satisfied expression of a feline who had successfully led a child on a merry chase. "Are you hurt, little bird?" Daniel asked, using the nickname he'd given Hope when she'd first learned to climb trees with fearless enthusiasm. "Nope," Hope declared cheerfully. "Mr. Whiskers is just really fast for an old cat." As Daniel checked Hope for scrapes and Sarah retrieved the cat, a sense of overwhelming gratitude washed over her. This moment, this ordinary, perfect moment of family life, was what she'd risked everything to achieve. Not just survival, but the right to live without fear, to love without reservation, and to raise her daughter in safety and joy. "Mama," Hope said, tugging on Sarah's sleeve, "tell me again about the mountain princes who built a castle in the clouds." It was Hope's favorite bedtime story, a tale Sarah had created about a brave princess who escaped from a dark kingdom and found her way to a magical mountain where she built a new life with a gentle giant and raised a daughter who could speak to animals. Hope had never asked if the story was true, but sometimes Sarah caught her daughter looking at her with an expression that suggested she understood more than she let on. "Tonight," Sarah promised. "But first, let's get you cleaned up for dinner." As they walked back toward the house, Hope skipping between her parents, Sarah reflected on the title Daniel had given her years ago during one of their late-night conversations in the caves. He'd called her an Empress, not because she ruled over others, But because she'd conquered herself, overcome impossible odds, and built an empire of love from nothing but determination and courage, the beaten pregnant woman who had fled into the mountains 6 years ago was gone, replaced by Rebecca Foster, mother, wife, writer, and the undisputed ruler of a small but perfect kingdom in the North Carolina hills. Her empire consisted of a rambling house with a wraparound porch, a garden where butterflies danced among the flowers, a workshop where her husband created beautiful furniture, and a daughter who believed the whole world was safe because her parents made it so. It wasn't the kind of empire that appeared in history books or commanded armies. But it was built on something more powerful than conquest or wealth. It was built on love, choice, and the radical act of refusing to let trauma define the future. As they reached the porch, Hope suddenly stopped and looked back at the mountains, visible in the distance. "Daddy," she said thoughtfully, "do you think the mountain princess was happy in her cloud castle?" Daniel and Sarah exchanged a look over their daughter's head, both of them thinking of hidden caves and desperate flights, and moments when survival seemed impossible. "I think," Daniel said carefully, "that the mountain princess was the happiest person in the whole world because she had everything that really mattered." "Good," Hope said with satisfaction. "Happy endings are the best kind." And as they walked into their home together, Sarah knew with absolute certainty that Hope was right. Happy endings were indeed the best kind, especially the ones you had to fight for, the ones you built with your own hands, and the ones that began not with once upon a time, but with the simple, revolutionary decision to choose love over fear. In the end, that choice had made Sarah Mitchell into Rebecca Foster, a frightened victim into a beloved empress, and a story of survival into a legacy of hope that would live on in her daughter's fearless laughter for generations to come. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.